This is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. Here's a simple question to kick off today's show. We've all heard of these franchises. What do the entertainment franchises of Star Wars and Harry Potter and the Lord of the Rings, and of course all the Marvel superhero comics, what do they all have in common? The answer, at least according to my guest today, the co-author of an intriguing new book, Revising Reality, How Sequels, Remakes, Retcons, and Rejects Explain the World, Chris Gavaler, is that they help us all together explain or make sense of reality. Chris Gavaler is joining us from Lexington, Virginia, where he teaches. Chris, what happens if these franchises, the Star Wars and the Harry Potters and the Lord of the Rings and the Marvel superhero comics, if they weren't around, how did we think about reality before they existed?
Well, the focus of the book is showing that fictional revisions of narratives are the same as nonfiction narratives. That we've gotten used to the way films and TV revise as they go, but in fact, the same narrative processes, the same kinds of revisions are taking place in real world storytelling. All stories, whether fictional or non-fictional, work basically the same way. So what Nathaniel and I are doing is looking at nonfiction stories and revealing that the same things are happening. Now, the fact that we're drawing our revision types from superheroes, from comics, is just a starting point. Ultimately, this is not analysis of Star Wars and superheroes. This is analysis of, frankly, much more important things. The United States political moment right now is affected by these same revisionary processes, which is the main reason why we're looking at it.
So explain that. Maybe I didn't articulate the original question very clearly, but we obviously have the rise of populism and this challenge on a certain kind of reality, what some people see as a scientific reality. Was there ever a moment before the narrative reality that you're writing about that was different, that we thought about the world differently?
Excellent question. I don't know the answer. We live in the current moment. I was born in 1966, so all I know is the cultural context of my own time period. If people thought differently in past decades and centuries, that's not available to me. However, I think the same processes have been going on this entire time. I don't think there's been any kind of change in how stories are revised. I think we simply have, at this current moment, an opportunity to recognize what those kinds of revisions are. So we're at a useful moment because these franchises, Star Wars and superheroes, etc., we can now apply concepts that grew out of them and apply them to the real world and understand the real world better as a result. So superheroes and Star Wars are helpful because they're giving us a new lens.
It's the old question, Chris, the chicken and egg
Mhm.
question. What came first, this version of reality which created these franchises, or the franchises themselves? How did they come about? Are they purely commercial? Did they come out of the recognition of large media companies that they could make fortunes from releasing and re-releasing and revising and adding sequels and pre-sequels? Or are they themselves creating the reality that you're describing in the book?
I think what's happened in the 20th century and now 21st century is with the franchises, we're getting a layering of stories. Now, there's certainly examples of multi volume stories told before, multiple sequels. But I think with the what we're currently seeing is a much deeper layering. So we're having corporations wanting to make as much money as they possibly can from some kind of internet and some kind of property. And so to do that, they need to keep revisiting it, revisiting it, revisiting it, revealing past facts, which is to say, inventing past facts so they can explore them in more detail. Now, this, as a result, these pop cultural franchises are now more like real world histories. You walk into choose I'm sorry, a bookstore of your choice, and you're going to see shelves and shelves of history books. Pick the topic, and there are going to be hundreds of books on that topic. Think of each of those as a kind of reboot or sequel or retcon of stories that you already know, but they're being told again. They're being told from different angles. They're revealing previously unknown information or emphasizing different details. The fictional franchises are now imitating that. And by imitating that, they're revealing how the nonfiction histories have always operated.
So, what kind of media existed before this? One of the things that always occurs to me in these kind of conversations, Chris, um, is that
Hmm.
these new franchises aren't really that different from the Old Testament, obsession with certain texts and rewrites and revisions and other obsessions. Is there a religious quality to this revisitation of reality that you write about in the new book?
I would say that the Bible, the Tanakh, the Book of Mormons, all of these are narrative revisions. So they were already doing what these current franchises are doing newly. So take the Tanakh. So if you are a person who believes that the Tanakh is a wholly inspired text, you probably call yourself a Jew, unless you call yourself a Christian because you believe that the Tanakh was sequeled into the New Testament, in which case you call it the Bible. And here's the key difference. If you're a Jew, if you're religiously Jewish, you believe the Tanakh is not part one of a two-part story. You believe that it's complete, the end of the story. The idea of it being sequeled, I imagine, would be blasphemous. Anything that claims to be a sequel to a complete scripture must be false. If you're Christian, you instead see, if you look at the Tanakh, renamed the Old Testament, the belief that that could be complete is completely false from a Christian point of view. It's only the first half of a story, and it's actually the second half that gives the first half meaning. That is narrative revision. If you're belong to the Church of the Latter-day Saints, you believe that there's actually three books because the Bible then is sequeled into the Book of Mormons. It tells the new adventures of Jesus Christ in the North America after his after the end of the Gospels. Again, so each one of those is a narrative revision of the previous one, and your religious position is defined by what you believe is narratively true. Which of those three endpoints is the actual endpoint?
You describe yourself, half jokingly, as the patron saint of superheroes. But isn't there a religious quality to all this? In all these, I call them franchises, maybe they're a better word to describe them, whether it's Marvel or Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, Star Wars, of course. We could probably include Star Trek as well. There's a religious quality. The fans who are ideological, if again that's the right word, in terms of their defending of the narratives of the sequels and the pre-sequels and the quality and the crimes perhaps of these creations.
And
Do we consume? I take your point, perhaps that in a sense the Bible is different from this, but do we humans consume these new franchises in the same way as we consume traditional religious texts, in
there's
terms of falling into them, of believing them, of making them the core of who we are?
there is a very similar intensity. I strongly agree. Now, with some of them, it's literally religious. I mean, Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, or Narnia, those texts were intended by their authors to be religious texts. I think more often what you're saying is an intensity from fans that, I don't know, if you call a Star Wars fan a zealot, you don't mean that in a literal sense, but you are pointing out that they are deriving something more than just entertainment from it. That often it seems that some piece of their identity gets attached to what were intended as merely entertainment becomes something more than entertainment. And there's something about their values, their identity, qualities that go well beyond entertainment that gets locked into these narratives, and then they defend them the same way they would defend a religious text. So they're for the example of like, oh, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, there's some minor group who feel that it was incorrect to read The Hobbit as merely the first book before The Lord of the Rings, and that in fact the original edition of The Hobbit should be read as a complete text that has no sequel. Very similar to the Tanakh versus the New Testament. Um, it's interesting when the intensity of these feelings really blow up online, and you see people attacking because they feel somehow that their identity is involved. And so when your identity is involved, I think it's very close to a religious understanding. I don't think anyone. It's intriguing because unlike the religious scriptures, which are understood to be literally true, I don't think anyone thinks Star Wars or Star Trek or any of these are literally true. However, that seems to be a minor point. They seem to have often the same intense emotional meaning to their fans.
I'm not so sure about that, Chris. I think if you came out here to Silicon Valley and you talked to some of the tech brothers about Star Trek or Star Wars, or above all else, Lord of the Rings, they think it is actually true. I mean, you could talk. Probably it might be hard to get through to Peter Thiel, but he names his companies after the stones in the Lord of the Rings.
That's fair.
Is this something that um, attracts a childlike devotion? Is there an age quality here? One associates Star Wars and Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, the Marvel superheroes with children. As a parent, I've been to too many of these movies. But of course, grown-ups seem to like them too.
Immensely,
What's
yeah.
your interpretation of the way in which perhaps these franchises extend childhood or universalize childhood or stunt adulthood in terms of contemporary Americans?
It's a tricky argument. It's going to vary person to person, text by text. Yeah, I think for the most part, these franchises, these stories are merely fun entertainment, and there's no harm done. I think in some cases, though, I don't even want to say fanatic, just a fan
Well, you can be rude on my show. I don't mind.
can be overly
We can talk
involved.
about the fanatics on our show.
That's fair. All right,
I'll
so
take responsibility if you say anything.
one example is when a franchise reveals or incorporates new characters or reinterprets old characters into new gender and racial identities. So suddenly there's a character who is black or a character who is female or a character who's gay. And in past iterations, those characters were straight white men. And and with alarming frequency, there are certain fans who profoundly reject that. And I find that deeply disturbing. I mean, I've got my old stories from my childhood that I care deeply about, but if a new version appears, great. That doesn't alter the old version. Let new things happen. But some folks seem to be overly invested in the way things were at their foundational moment. And I think that's about their own self identity. So, like I said before, the self identity getting involved in these narratives means that any change to them is felt like a threat. So, in a weird sense, so like, if there's a character, I'm going to do Green Lantern. I think it was in 2012, DC put out a new version of Green Lantern from the 1930s, 1940s version, who is now in the new version gay. If you if you are homophobic, that scares you because it says that if you can reboot a character who was previously straight into someone who's now gay, that implies that that shift can happen for anyone, so that there is some possible you out there who might be gay. And if you're not comfortable with that fact, you're going to protest very loudly, I believe. And that's deeply unfortunate.
And it's interesting when the author of one of these franchises
Mm,
falls into that trap. Of course, we all know the stories, the controversies about J.K. Rowling, who invented the Harry Potter
indeed.
franchise, who wrote the books, now has come out very vociferously and controversially against the trans community, or at least that's how some people see it.
Yeah.
So even the authors of these franchises can fall into that trap, can fall back on the certainties of the past.
Now, one nice thing about the Harry Potter example is that the fans, by writing fan fiction, which they can't publish or make money on, but there's a massive Harry Potter fan fiction world online. They take Rowling's stories and they very intentionally create trans characters as a way of speaking against her and keeping the franchise close to them. So, and that's an example of fans rejecting not the story world, but the author, and keeping the story world and divorcing the viewpoint of the author. It's interesting. Authors ultimately lose control of the things they create. And I think it's exciting the fan fiction that comes out that pushes against Rowling's positions.
And of course, that's particularly the case in the digital age. We talk about some of these large media companies, the Disneys of the world, or the Marvel Comics, who own these franchises. But in the digital age, power has shifted, hasn't it? And so the reality you talk about, this revisitation of reality, isn't just a top-down process.
It has expanded. The internet, a lot of problems with the internet, but in fact, it does have some good things. So this kind of fan fiction websites could not have existed, and nothing equivalent could have existed even 20 years ago, let alone 30 or 40. So it is a new world. Those expansions are positive, but at the same time, Disney is such a juggernaut, and it can just put out product after product after product, continually revising and revising and revising. It's hard to fight that, but at the same time, there are ways that fans become empowered.
Disney, of course, is a large capitalist company, and there are cultural interpreters. Chris, you know this better than I do. You're in the business, or a certain kind of business. Maybe yours is a non-profit in a sense. You teach at university. The inheritors of the Marxist tradition, of the Frankfurt School, of the Adornos and the Marcuses of the world, who might see all this big culture as just a way to get the kids and the adults to take their mind off the realities of the world itself. Marx, of course, talked about religion as the opium of the people. The Frankfurt School see mass culture as the opium of the people. Is there any truth in that, Chris? Is this consciously or otherwise a way to get people to forget about their real lives and focus on what to some of us seems like absurd fiction?
I would say I would be surprised if that's anyone's intent. I don't think anyone at Disney is thinking about anything other than making the most money they possibly can. But if the effect is that, then yeah, I definitely think that is the case. But there's not. I don't think there's any intentionality to dulling our senses, which is not to say our senses don't become dulled.
Well, if your senses are dulled, don't worry. Chris is going to wake you up. He's the author or co-author of an interesting new book, Revising Reality: How Sequels, Remakes, Retcons, and Rejects Explain the World. Want to thank our friends at Liberties, the quarterly journal of culture and politics, also in the business of making sense of culture, who are helping us bring us great guests like Chris Gavaler. I'm going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Chris to talk more specifically about how the sequels and the remakes are making us rethink reality in the age of Donald Trump of the 2020s. So don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Chris Gavaler, the co-author of Revising Reality, How Sequels, Remakes, Retcons, and Rejects Explain the World. In the introduction, Chris, you noted that this book that you wrote with Nat Goldberg is an attempt to make sense of our current realities, particularly our political realities in the 2020s. There's, of course, you know this better than I do, a raging debate about the reinvention of reality, the challenge to scientific truths. How does your narrative, your argument in this book explain the rise of what many of us see as fantasists like Donald Trump?
Well, one thing to keep in mind about if you're revising history, you're not just having a discussion about the past, you're actually simultaneously revising the present moment. You're changing the meaning of the world right now. Donald Trump is a particularly useful and horrifying example of that, in my opinion. He's encapsulating a phenomenon that's been going on for at least decades, if not centuries, too, at least. Um, the revising of the meaning of the United States, particularly its founding documents and the authors of those founding documents. This is an example of retconning, which is a term that comes from superhero comics, which makes it sound silly, and that's fair. It means retroactive continuity, where it looks like something happened, where the past impression is changed because you receive new information and therefore reinterpret the old interpretation away. It vanishes because you've learned something new. There's a revelation. It's not just adding information. It's revealing that the past that you thought existed never existed at all. So what's happening right now with many Donald Trump followers is that process of retconning the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, turning them into, and I mean this in a literal sense, religious scripture. So when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, when the Constitution was written years afterwards, it was understood by everyone in the room writing those documents and everyone in the United States who knew about them as these are simply human beings writing words, and that's it. They were important, extremely important political documents. But at some point, there's been a slow retconning in which they are instead understood to be written by God through prophets. Thomas Jefferson somehow has become a prophet. Now, Jefferson, at the time when he ran for president in 1800, his opponents called him a howling atheist. They said if that infidel gets into the White House, it'll be the end of Christianity in the United States. That person somehow has become a divine prophet with God working through him, and so we see this happening increasingly. I think it's been happening definitely for decades, but it seems to be particularly on the rise. The most recent example, and this actually came out after we submitted our book for publication, it was in late March. Donald Trump endorsed what's called the God Bless America Bible. Now, the Bible includes the King James Version of the Old and New Testaments. It also includes the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Now, that is a change of religion. So the same way that the Tanakh became the Old Testament when combined with the New Testament to create the Bible, and then the Book of Mormon joins the Bible to create the Church of the Latter-day Saints, we have in the United States right now a new religion. And I'm not sure how new it is. I think it goes back decades. Again, might go back to the mid 1800s. This building concept that the United States is actually divine. The quote unquote founding fathers are prophets, and that we are living at this moment in a time period that's like biblical time period where someone like Donald Trump is appointed by God to achieve a religious aim. that is a strange moment to be living in, and that's what, and it's the concept of retconning makes that explicit.
Is it so strange, Chris? Could one argue that actually the reverse is true, that that's the normal, for better or worse, nature of history, your retconning, and that we've always had these religious beliefs, as we talked about a little bit at the beginning about the relationship between these franchises and the Bible, that America was founded in deep religious belief in the return to the promise of God on earth and all the rest of it, and that this is what humans want. And it actually even can be seen in some of these superhero narratives that you write about when you think of
Indeed.
Batman and that nostalgia for an idyllic moment before the
Mhm.
violence of Gotham. Isn't it just what humans want, need, desire, and it's more normal than the alternative that you're presenting?
Well, I don't think we're actually disagreeing. I The term retcon is newly available, and so we can recognize this process more clearly with a term and a definition for it. I think previously, what's been happening is that there have been revisions to how we understand history, but we haven't been fully able to understand what those revisions are. So I agree with you. This isn't new, but it is newly named and newly identifiable. So what's happening now, by calling it a retcon, I can say what happened is there was a previous understanding of Thomas Jefferson. He was a interesting political leader, president, writer. You could say a variety of things about him, but he was not a prophet. He was not a divine individual. And now, and I think this actually started probably decades ago, but now it particularly has culminated so that some people in the United States understand him to be a divine prophet. They have retconned him, they have retconned the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence into scriptures. I think we have, now this doesn't have a name at the moment. I refer to it as the Church of America, and I don't even mean that like mockingly. I, in the same way that Church of the Latter-day Saints is distinct from Christianity, same way that Christianity is distinct from Judaism. I believe that the Church of America is distinct from all three because they've added new scriptures, which are written by God through human beings and are infallible, to their book of scriptures, and they call it God Bless America Bible.
Yeah, and of course, in the culture that you write about, there's a character called Captain America who might be a leader of all this. It's interesting you've mentioned Thomas Jefferson a few times. Jefferson, though, is more idolized, if that's the right word, or more more worshipped on the left than on the right, isn't he? At least in terms of his suspicion of large government, his cult of the earth and of farming. This is not necessarily just a right-wing thing in the way in which we traditionally distinguish right and left politics.
No, it's not necessarily anything. Anyone from any religious background or viewpoint, left or right or what have you, could potentially understand the United States as being led by God and that these documents are in some sense divine. It is, however, overwhelmingly predominant on the right half of the spectrum, I would say. Having spoken with conservative Republicans for a while, I was part of a discussion group. Our only goal was to try to communicate across, the partisan divide. And members of this group, I had good conversations with them, respect them deeply. We were, you know, friends, I would even say, and they were able to communicate to me how prevalent and how deeply these ideas run among Christian conservatives. Most Christian conservatives have not done deep dives into history, but as it was described to me, it was how common household understanding of the nature of the United States is that it's divine. I think that is far more common on the right than on the left.
You present your argument as if these people who believe in the divinity of history or the divinity of America or the divinity of of Thomas Jefferson are somehow exceptional, unusual, you don't seem particularly sympathetic, you assume that there's an alternative view. What is that? And you're suggesting, I think, or maybe correct me if I'm wrong, that it's normal, perhaps scientific. What's the alternative to thinking about Jefferson, for example, as an eternal figure, as the neo godlike founder of the American Republic?
Well, okay, two comments to that. So there are, I don't know, about 200 million Christians in the United States and about 2.5 billion across the world. So you've got Christians in the United States who have, evolved into this mindset of understanding the United States as divine and these documents as divine. They are a very small percentage of the worldwide Christian population, and no one outside of the United States would, who is a Christian, would even find any of these ideas plausible. It is a very strange idea to anyone who's a Christian outside of the United States. So most Christians would be, I think, baffled by this viewpoint. For people in the United States who do not share this viewpoint, I mean, Thomas Jefferson was one of the founders of the United States. I'm speaking just for myself. I respect him as a founder. He was a complicated person, flaws, but also positive qualities. He was just a mixed human being like any mixed human being. I don't know. The idea of deifying him, I think, is, well, dangerous because it prevents us from saying or even recognizing anything critical about him. I've had conservatives accuse me of demonizing Thomas Jefferson simply because I said, and this is in the most literal sense, he is a racist. He is someone who said overtly that black people are inferior to white people. Said that overtly. Now you could say, well, but everyone believed that then. Okay, then everyone was a racist then. I'm not making, it's not even a judgment, it's just simply a fact. He was a racist. But by saying that objective fact, I was accused of demonization because they had sanctified him. They were seeing him as a prophet. So how dare you say my prophet was in any way anything but good?
How is your argument, how does it play out in terms of the arguments you make in Revising Reality of other very controversial contemporary issues like abortion? I know you have a section in the book addressing Roe versus Wade.
Yeah, it's again, this is why I think this is useful to have these terms. Looking at the Supreme Court through the lens of these revisions is particularly useful. So what we looking at whenever the Supreme Court overthrows a law, they are not sequeling it. They're not making a new change. They are actually revealing the logic of the judicial overthrow is that they were revealing the way things always were. So when Roe v. Wade was overthrown recently, it was the argument from the Supreme Court is not that there was a period of time where there was a right for an abortion, and now we've started the next period of time in which there is not a right to abortion. That's not what the Supreme Court did. Their claim was a retcon. They were saying there was never a right for abortion, and we are now revealing the status quo that's always existed. For a period of time, 50 years, according to our current Supreme Court, we just misunderstood the nature of reality. And now they've revealed what always had been all along. That is a retcon, and that's what the Supreme Court does every time they overthrow any law. The law was never a law. That's the logic of the Supreme Court retcon.
You're not a legal scholar, Chris. You're a cultural analyst. You're a patron saint of superheroes. I'm guessing you don't argue in the book that the conservatives on the Supreme Court are spending all their time watching Star Wars or Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, or reading Marvel comics. So I don't really understand how your argument works. Are they just the conservatives on the Supreme Court when it comes to something like Roe versus Wade? Have they simply unknowingly soaked up our increasingly Disneyfied culture, or is there something more complicated going on?
Certainly more complicated. I will say Amy Bennett is a huge Tolkien fan, but that's the exception. No, but she's not being influenced, well, to the best of my knowledge, by this. Again, this is not just a contemporary court. You mentioned abortion, so I spoke specifically to that. But going back to the beginning of the Supreme Court, going back to some of the very first cases in the 1800s, they established the right of the court to determine what is and is not a law constitutionally. At that point, and this is going back to I think 18 teens, the court established its primary power is to retcon laws out of existence, revealing that a law was never a law, it was just mistaken to be one. So the word retcon is new, but it has actually entered legal vernacular. So as we look in our chapter, we find a half dozen cases of law articles in which the term retcon comes up. We find about a half dozen examples of judicial rulings in which the word retcon is used. So retcon actually has entered the legal system as a term, but more significantly, the concept of retconning has been there since the beginning.
The founders of the Republic, men like Jefferson, we've already talked about, believed in the idea of a separation between church and state. But your argument seems to be suggesting that everything is church. What is the state?
I'm not sure if I'm arguing that. I would argue that some people have retconned the church into the state. So if you are a believer, if you believe that the Constitution is scripture, then you've retconned it and you've eliminated any division between church and state. If you do not believe that the Constitution was inspired by God, written by God, and through a human hand, then you believe in a completely different reality. This is what's most difficult about our current contemporary political problems. Many people who follow Trump believe that they're living in a world in which God is directly intervening, using Trump as his emissary to continue the process, the divine process that is the United States. Other folks believe that no, this is not a religious situation. This is purely political, social world, and we're having elections and trying to just continue the job of democracy. These two worlds co-locate. So when we talk about Trump or we talk about the Constitution, even though we're talking about the same set of words, they are a different set of words if you believe they were written by God than if you believe that they were written by human beings. We are so fundamentally disagreeing, we're not really even communicating to each other anymore.
The people who write these franchises, make them, the people at Disney or Marvel, I'm guessing they probably agree with you about most of them. Most of them aren't great fans of Donald Trump or conservative religious people in America. I'm still not entirely clear what is causing what, but what are you arguing in the book? Are you suggesting that our sequel, remake, retcon culture should be transformed by our cultural powers from above? Are you suggesting people stop reading these things? Well, what's
Not
the
a bit.
core argument in the book?
Our point is that looking at fictional narrative, learning the tools of fictional narrative gives you a lens, a machine, a way of understanding nonfiction. We're not actually making an argument for things need to be different. We're providing a way of understanding the way things are and arguably have always been. I suppose it's a retcon in that sense too. We're not advocating, we're neither pro nor con. Actually, Nathaniel's a huge Tolkien fan and Star Wars fan, and I love superheroes. So we quite enjoy contemporary franchises. However, we're neither pro nor con. We're not suggesting that they go away or that they be expanded or anything like that. We're just pointing out that, look, we can understand reality better because of the tools that these narratives give us.
And finally, Chris, and maybe I keep on asking the same question, not really. I'm not really nailing it very well, but You use this word reality as if it really exists.
Mm.
What for you, what for Chris Gavaler, what is reality?
Yeah, so that's the problem, and that's why these conflicts occur. There is no way to determine what reality is. Each of us will have our own experience. We might have communities that share those experiences, but ultimately there's no way to negotiate differences. That's the problem. So with each of these examples I've given, if someone understands the Constitution to be a religious document and someone understands it to be entirely a political document, there's no way to come to agreement. There's no kind of evidence, there's no kind of judicial system to clarify what is reality. That is the problem. Reality is continuously open ended, is always revisable. In the next decade, in the next decade, things that we understand to be true right now, like say, scientifically true right now, could easily be overturned. So it's a constant process of endless revision, and it never, yeah, we can't. There is set here. Let me clarify one point. I believe that there's some reality out there, but we can't get to it. So something metaphysically is true on any topic, but we don't have the ability to get there. And so all we have is the set of knowledge that we have, and that set of knowledge is always incomplete. So all we have are claims about an ultimately unknowable reality, and then what we work with are the stories we write about that unknowable reality, and those stories